Back Look Cinema, the podcast.
You make man like me? No, woman, friend for you. Woman, friend. Yes, I want friend like me. My name is Zoe. It's spelled Z-O or Z to the O for those of you outside of the U.S. Welcome back, friends. This is the 160th episode of Backlook Cinema, the podcast. We take a look back at the movies of yesteryear, especially the movies from the latter half of the last millennium. But if you've been listening for the past couple of episodes in October, I've actually been going way back to the 1930s and 40s and whatnot, because I want to examine the classical monster movies. Now, so far, I've talked about Dracula and Frankenstein, and we are going to continue in that vein. But first, if you like what you're about to hear, then tell your family, tell your friends, and, well, you know what? Just stay away from that tall, aging, gray-haired fellow. Yeah, the one in the lab coat. Something ain't right about him. So I want to talk about The Bride of Frankenstein. It's interesting because it was a movie that there's only one scene that I remember from the movie, and I'm pretty sure that I didn't watch most of the movie. And I feel like had I watched most of the movie at the time that it came out, I would have enjoyed it. Because unlike Dracula or Frankenstein, there really is no part in The Bride of Frankenstein where one can just check out. Like, as a child, you know, in Dracula, it was so quiet and it was paced so slowly that for a child, there just wasn't enough happening, right? And the same could be said about Frankenstein. The Bride of Frankenstein is a completely different beast, however. It's faster pace. There are a lot of things happening in it, and I think it's about an hour and 15 minutes long or something like that. And just in spite of it being such a short film, it really packs a lot in. They get it in the short time they had. It's kind of fascinating when you look at it. I have heard people say it's of the classical monster movies, it's probably the best one. And for me, the verdict is still out. I feel like I need to watch more monster movies. I feel like I need to watch The Mummy or The Werewolf, or no, it's called The Wolfman, and some of the other classical movies from the 30s and 40s and whatnot. And then there are a bunch of Dracula sequels, and there's also the Son of Frankenstein, that sequel. So I feel like I should kind of revisit some of these movies before I make my final verdict. But I have to say, their argument has merit. There is an argument to be made that the 1935 The Bride of Frankenstein could be one of the best horror movies of that era. And just because it's faster paced than a lot of the other horror movies of that time, and there is a lot going on. And as I said, I probably watched it at home when I was growing up as a rerun. Not a rerun, but they would show a lot of these films during Halloween or during October. So October, all the monster movies would start coming on, and then especially from the black and white era of movies, and you know, we would just sit down and watch some of them. And if they would, actually, I'm going to be honest, a lot of them just didn't maintain my attention. Even the ones that I purposely watched, like I went an extended length to watch this movie, not this movie, The Bride of Frankenstein, but other movies. Like, you know, it was a whole thing to gather the family together to watch a particular movie, and then me quickly losing interest in that movie. And I'll talk about the movie later on. At least I'll clue you in on the end of the episode of the movie that I'm talking about. But for right now, let's get into The Bride of Frankenstein, 1935. He's alive! He's alive! In spite of being tossed from the top of a 3-story windmill on a dark and dreary night by the very monster he created, Dr. Henry Frankenstein survived the fall and was being nursed back to health. Meanwhile, it was quickly discovered that the monster also survived the collapse of the burning windmill and resumed roaming and terrorizing the countryside. The news of the monster's survival garnered the attention of Dr. Pretorius. To that end, he made a surprise visit to the recovering Henry. The perhaps mentally unstable Pretorius is engaged with a series of experiments that are similar to Henry's, and wants Henry's help in bringing forth his ultimate project, a bride for Frankenstein's monster. So this movie, The Bride of Frankenstein, was released May 6, 1935, produced by Universal Pictures. It garnered grossed about $2 million between 1935 and 1943. And in today's dollars, that's about $41 million. And it had a reported budget of $397,000 or $8 million in today's dollars. And I'll take this opportunity to make a correction from the Frankenstein episode. In the Frankenstein episode, I was saying that the budget was around $300,000, but that is not correct. The actual budget for Frankenstein was $262,000. So this movie, The Bride of Frankenstein, is almost 200. Well, the budget I think was for around 300,000 or something like that, or it was like 290,000, and it went like $100,000 over budget. So they spent more money on this movie than they had meant to. But it turned out to be all right, as you can see by the budget numbers. I don't really have the resources or the patience really to get the most accurate or the most factually correct figure on what the movie profit was or what the gross was. So all I could give you was the figure that I mentioned earlier, $2 million between 1935 and 1943. But then again, movies tended to stay in theaters for a very long time. They didn't, like today, movies go from theater to television in just a matter of weeks. But back in the 1930s, a movie could stay in theaters for years, even as late as the 1980s. They could stay in the movie theater for at least a year, if not a little. They could stay in a movie theater for like 18 months, right? If the movie was still making money, they would stay in the theater, because once it was removed from the theater, you wouldn't see it for a long time. Even after they came out with video cassettes, you could expect a movie to come on cassettes after its theatrical run. In about, I don't know, maybe a year, maybe another 18 months after it's in the theater. It really did take a long time. It was only like, I think the late 90s, the early 2000s, where the time kind of shortened. So it kind of shortened up to 6 months after the theatrical one that the movies would appear on, either on cable, and then on like, not VHS, because like in the 90s, I mean, yeah, VHS, but by that time you had DVDs and DVDs. DVDs was the object du jour that the studios would put their movies on, and then much later came the Blu-ray. But yeah, being in a theater for a long time, that would definitely give a chance for a movie to amass a great deal of money. So, that being said, let's talk about who starred in the movie. Top billing is Boris Karloff, although in this movie he's credited as Karloff. And I'm told that that's kind of how he was credited, because he was such a big star. They didn't even bother calling him Boris Karloff. He just had a mononym. So it was like, they just call him Karloff, and you knew who they were talking about. He stars as the monster, and you may have seen him in The Haunted Stranger, Frankenstein 1970, where I believe he plays Dr. Frankenstein. There's also, or he plays a Dr. Frankenstein, like a descendant or something. There's also Charlie Chan at the Opera. And also, while doing research for this, I just found out that he's also the voice of the Grinch and the narrator in How the Grinch Stole Christmas, the TV movie that premiered in the 1960s. I think it was 1966. So there's that. Up next is Lisa Lanchester. She plays Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Also, she played the monster's mate. You may have seen her in Witness for the Prosecution, Murder by Death, or Mary Poppins. Up next is Colin Clive. He plays Baron Henry Frankenstein. And you may have seen him in Looking Forward, Lily Christine, The Stronger Sex, and also a note for Colin Clive. Now, obviously, he's reprising his role as Dr. Frankenstein in this sequel, but people were concerned because his alcoholism had gotten worse. He had a bit of a habit, but the director Whale did not want to recast because Whale appreciated Clive's hysterical quality, and he felt that was necessary for the film. Up next is Valerie Hobson. She plays Baroness Elizabeth Frankenstein. You may have seen her in Great Expectations, Kind Hearts and Coronets, or Werewolf in London. That's an interesting title because it reminds me of a later film called An American Werewolf in London. So now I know why there's a movie out there called An American Werewolf in London. Probably because of this movie, Werewolf in London. It's all making sense to me now. Up next is Ernest Thesiger. He plays Dr. Septimus Pretorius. You may have also seen him in A Christmas Carol. Oh, I forgot to write the year, but I believe it's 1933 or so. Another movie called The Robe, and also you might have seen him in The Dark Old House. The funny thing is that I watched this version of of A Christmas Carol last year as one of the Christmas movies, just for my enjoyment. And I don't remember seeing him. I don't quite recognize him. And also, it's a very old movie, and the resolution of the picture was not fantastic. So there's that. Up next is Gavin Gordon. He plays Lord Byron. You may have seen him in Mystery of the Wax Museum, The Scarlet Empress, or The Bat. Up next is Douglas Walton. He plays Percy Bysshe Shelley. You may have also seen him in The Count of Monte Cristo in 1934, Murder, My Sweet, or The Picture of Dorian Gray from 1945. Una O'Connor plays Minnie. You may have seen her in Witness for the Prosecution, The Invisible Man, or The Adventures of Robin Hood. E. Clive plays the Burgomaster. You may have also seen him in The Hound of the Baskervilles from 1939, or Pride and Prejudice from 1940. O.P. Hagee plays the Blind Hermit. You may have seen him in The Count of Monte Cristo, the same as the earlier movie, or The Batman. And finally, Dwight Fry, who plays Carl. I mentioned Carl when I talked about Dracula. He's been in a lot of movies, kind of playing the same character to his detriment. You may have also seen him in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman or Sleepy Time Gal. So this movie was directed by James Whale. He's had a number of very popular movies from his day, and they include They Dare Not Love, Green Hall, Port of Seven Seas, Wives of Suspicion, or The Road Back. This movie was written by Mary Shelley, John L. Balderston, William Hurlbut, and uncredited Edmund Pearson. So, as you know, as I mentioned before, Mary Shelley she wrote the original novel Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus. But in this movie, she is now credited as Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, as opposed to Mrs. Percy B. Shelley, as she was in the previous movie. And you'll probably notice that some of these names, they seem familiar. Like, didn't you just say that name? It's like, yes, I was. Somebody was playing her in the movie. Somebody played Mary Shelley, and somebody played her husband, Percy Shelley, in part of the movie. And we'll get to that. So the thing they specifically took from the novel this time was the element of the bride, the mate for Frankenstein's monster. That singular element was what they used from the book for this movie. Most of this movie is not really taken from the book. This is like, if they took the element of the bride for Frankenstein's monster from her book, and they went in a completely different direction with it. John L. Balderston, there were several attempts to create a sequel for Frankenstein, and they had nothing to do with the monster having a bride. And Balderston was the one who went back to the source material. He went back to Mary Shelley's novel to craft the movie out of part of that novel. And so it was his idea to craft the Bride of Frankenstein. And then finally we have William Hurlbut and Edmund Pearson. I don't remember how I said it the last time. Anyways, James Wells still wasn't satisfied with the script, so he brought on Hurlbut and Pearson to do the rewrites. Now, Hurlbut is credited for writing Ladies Must Love, Madam Spy, Orchids to You, Rainbow on the River, The Darling Young Man. Those are some of the things that he did. As for Pearson, he's a playwright, and he's uncredited in this movie. And the only other work he did for the films where there's a movie called Werewolf in London. He did that one. He's mainly known for his many published works, both in fiction and nonfiction. And he's also known for his essay on Lizzie Borden. Now, I don't know if it was this particular essay that popularized Lizzie Borden, but that's definitely what he's best known for. The music is by Franz Waxman. He's also written music for The Nun Story, Run Silent, Run Deep, Peyton Place, Beloved Infidel, The Spirit of St. Louis, and Saranara. So that is all for the opening credits. Also, I want to take this time to ask if you could check out the shop I have over at Backlick Cinema /shop. I got some neat t-shirt designs over there. Nothing new, but you never know when something new is going to pop up. Maybe in between these recordings, something new will pop up, and then you'll go there. It's like, oh, there's something new. Let me get it. It's awesome, or something. I'm imagining that you're saying this to yourself. And for that, I am eternally grateful. So that's it for the opening credits. And now we're going to talk about some of our favorite parts. And we're back. Going to talk about some of our favorite parts of The Bride of Frankenstein. Now, when I get into the favorite parts, it could be like a scene, a musical cue, a special effect, an actor. It could be any of these things. And it's kind of hard to nail down like just 5 things that I really like. But there are a lot of things that are different that they made in this movie that's different from not just the predecessor, but the earlier 1931 films. So this movie came out in 1935. And so I guess in that time, in that like 4 or 5 year period, there were some changes made in the film industry. The first thing I noticed was that there was a notice at the very beginning of the film that says, "This picture approved by the production code Administration of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. And then it has a certificate 768. And so I thought that was interesting. And this is an early form of the, what's it called? The MPA or the MPAA. But anyway, you'll know them because they're the guys that they rate the movies. So this was a change in from when I watched Dracula and Frankenstein. I don't know if they were around in 1931, but by the time we reached 1935, they got this whole message before you start watching the movie. I guess they want to assure audiences that there's nothing that will upset them too much. Like it won't be like, it might be bad, but it won't be too bad. This is our seal of approval. I guess this is our early stepping stones to the type of censorship that we see today with the rating system. So before the rating system, they would just put this notice on, I guess, to let people know that this movie's all right, or it's safe enough. Another thing that I noticed as I watched this was the use of non-diegetic music in the film. As you recall, in Dracula and Frankenstein, most of that music was diegetic. You only really heard non-diegetic music in the opening credits or in the ending credits, but there were no characters. So whether the music was diegetic or non-diegetic was kind of a moot point because there's no characters. But within the film itself or themselves, both of the movies, whenever you saw the characters and you heard the music, the characters were in a place where you would expect to hear music. So like in Frankenstein, there was a wedding and you could hear music being played at a wedding. Or in Dracula's case, it was at a theater. So if you heard music in the film, it's because the characters could hear it because it was in a place that you would expect to hear music. So my guess is that by 1935, filmmakers were not worried about audiences being confused by non-diegetic music. And hearing the music as part of the background as an audience member, it greatly improved my enjoyment of the film. I guess you know the basic story of The Bride of Frankenstein, where Frankenstein and the doctor survived. Like, it was kind of traumatic at the end of Frankenstein, where he throws the doctor off the top of a windmill, and he actually, like, the doctor actually bounces off one of the windmill blades before he actually hits the ground, and it looks like he's like 3 stories high. So that's quite a fall. And and then the last time you see Frankenstein, it's the tower has been set on fire, and then it collapses on top of him, and you can see him burning with the debris on top of him. But they resolved this rather ingeniously, mainly because the studio, as soon as they begin to suspect that they had a hit on their hands, they begin making plans for a sequel. They've been cajoling and conniving and harassing the director, James Whale, into making another film. And for a long time, he was resistant to making a sequel. He felt that the story of Frankenstein was finished, but the studio was like, nuh-uh, there's money to be made, son. you gotta do this. So at the beginning of this movie, The Bride of Frankenstein, it's like right after. It's like not even right after. It's like the same scene. They just extended the scene of them so at the windmill, like after the windmill's collapsed, and the angry mob is still there, and they think Frankenstein is dead, the Dr. Frankenstein, and they gather around Dr. Frankenstein, the angry mob, and they realize that he's okay. And I should note that it's not publicly known that Dr. Frankenstein created the monster. There's only a few people that actually know this. It's kind of a secret. And it doesn't necessarily want everybody to know that he was responsible for all of the death and destruction that had occurred. And so they rescue the doctor. They take him up to his what do they call it? A manor. a chateau. I think it's called Chateau Frankenstein. His father is a baron, so I'm not exactly sure if that title extends to him while his father's still alive. I guess it does, because later on in the movie they refer to him as Baron Frankenstein, and it's unclear whether his father is still alive or not. So I'll take that as a sign that, because when they rescue him from the windmill site, his father is quite alive. Like, his father is definitely alive. He was featured prominently in Frankenstein. And so since this is taking place at the base of the windmill when this movie starts, that man, Baron Frankenstein, is still alive. So I'm supposing that the title is transferable, just like there can be multiple princes. Like if a king has, there's one crown prince, and then there's a bunch of other princes that are brothers and cousins. So I suppose the same thing can be said for barons. I'm not up on how royalty works. In any case, the angry mob, I guess no longer angry, takes Dr. Frankenstein back to Chateau Frankenstein. But there are a couple of people are just kind of hanging back because they want to see the burned remains of the monster before they decide to move on and fully declare that the monster is dead. But the monster survives because somehow the windmill is built over some kind of cavern with water running through it. And when the tower collapses, the monster is pushed into this cavern and he's basically saved. He's in this water. There are people kind of like hanging around in an effort to maintain his anonymity, because he's alive, but he doesn't necessarily want people to know that he's alive. Or maybe he doesn't care. I don't know. He just gets upset easily. So he basically he kills like the first couple of people that get near him when as he's trying to climb out of this pool of water that's under the windmill. There's a third person that he runs into, but he doesn't kill her. That's Minnie. She's kind of like the maid for the Frankensteins, and she's kind of the comic relief of the movie. I know a lot of what's happening in The Bride of Frankenstein is supposed to be comedy or comic relief, and it doesn't hit like it used to hit in 1935, I guess. But I could tell that the audiences would have found this funny. I can tell that, this is supposed to be an amusing moment, because a lot of the stuff that she was doing kind of reminded me of like old Abbott and Costello routines. Like the way her expression was, the way she talked, her escalations or whatever. So she sees the monster and she runs away. We all have a big laugh, I guess. And then the monster just kind of wanders off. So later on in the film, Frankenstein is bedridden because, he fell from a tower, and then he's visited by his mentor. It's Dr. Septimus Pretorius. And just another mad doctor wanting to make stuff that maybe he shouldn't. So he's doing the same kind of research as Frankenstein is doing, and he basically tempts Frankenstein to help him do this work. And ultimately, what they're trying to do is bring about a female companion for the monster, because everybody knows that the monster is alive now. He's alive. He's murdering people, or he's defending himself. But at the same time, the monster goes on his own journey and becomes slightly more civilized. He meets kind people, and he's kind to those people, and he's able to learn from those people, and he's able to kind of enjoy life a little bit. At one point, when I was talking about Frankenstein, he was happy for one moment, but in this movie, he's happy for an extended period of time. He gains a little bit. He gains a little bit of intellect. He learns to speak, and so that he can communicate with people. But then he's finally captured, and then he escapes, and then he actually develops a partnership with Dr. Pretorius. Dr. Pretorius says, he wants to make a woman for Frankenstein's monster, I should say. I don't want to get Dr. Frankenstein confused with the monster. And I'll explain again why I think it's okay to refer to the monster as Frankenstein, but for the purpose of this audio program, I am going to separate the two so that I don't confuse myself and I don't confuse you. So anyway, the monster and ends up finding Dr. Pretorius, and he tells the monster, yeah, we're gonna build you a girl, so a friend for you. And Frankenstein, see, there I go again. The monster loves that idea. He loves it. He's down with it. So they go, like near the end, the third act, the end of the movie, they end up at Dr. Pretorius's town. He has a castle somehow, and they're conducting these experiments, and I'm sure it's Dr. Pretorius' tower and not Dr. Frankenstein's tower. Anyways, so they do it. They're able to create this woman, and she wakes up. She's not thrilled about the whole thing. She doesn't particularly like the male monster, and she starts screaming and whatnot. And and as you can imagine, the monster is very disappointed in how this all turns out, and he is around some very sensitive equipment. We'll just say it like that. And his hand is near a lever. And I guess it was Dr. Pretorius is like, stop, don't touch that lever. If you do, you'll release all of this energy and the whole tower will come crashing down. And Elizabeth, Frankenstein's wife, she happens to show up at the tower. And the monster tells Dr. Frankenstein and his wife to go get out of the tower, go away. You live. And then to Dr. Pretorius and the mate that was supposed to be made for him, he told them, we belong dead. And then he pulls the lever, and that's basically the end of the movie. So I'm sure you knew all of that. I just wanted to do the breakdown, because when I go over my favorite parts, we won't get lost. I can go back and forth and up and down and round and round, and you'll know a kind of what I'm talking about. So that was a lot. Let's take a break for a moment. And I just want to tell you about a podcast that I've been listening to called Witches Talking Tarot and Other Things. The show is hosted by Amber and Maddie, and I'll just let them tell you what their show is about.
I'm Maddie.
And I'm Amber. And we're Witches Talking Tarot.
And we're bringing you all things occult.
Every Tuesday and Thursday, twice a week for your magical pleasure.
Join us as we dive into aliens,
cryptids, the Illuminati,
super in the natural.
Because that's the kind of witches we are. So join these high energy witches twice a week. Come sit a spell and see why we'll be your favorites.
Welcome back. This movie had a curious beginning. So in the previous movie, Frankenstein, one of the actors came out to the audience and he talked about how terrifying that this movie was going to be. And after that announcement, he says, you've been warned, and he kind of walks away. In this movie, they do something a little bit different. They have a scene where it's Mary Shelley and her husband and a friend of theirs, and they're kind of around in this cabin, I guess in the middle of nowhere. And I guess this is supposed to be kind of a dramatization of the circumstances with which Mary wrote her book. And they're talking about the story of Frankenstein and how what the story means to them and all this other kind of stuff. And they're kind of saying like, oh, it's a shame that the story ended with the death of Frankenstein and the monster. And she said, but no, that's not the end of the story. And she kind of proceeds to tell the story that is the Bride of Frankenstein, the movie. The only thing is that the story in Frankenstein, like especially how it ended at the windmill, is not exactly how it transpired in her book, but they're just kind of saying in this movie that's what she wrote or whatever. Because when she wrote the book, I think it ends with Frankenstein and the monster ending up in the Arctic somewhere or something like that. They kind of do a little bit of globetrotting. But my memories, I read it so long ago that my memories are fuzzy, but I do remember something about them ending up in the Arctic. And I think that the monster eventually kills Dr. Frankenstein. And I think the monster dies too. I'm not exactly sure. Anyways, and before that happens, they do have in the course of the book, the doctor makes a female monster a mate for his male monster. So a lot of this stuff happens in the book, but it doesn't happen the same way as it happens in the movie. But in this little scene at the beginning of The Bride of Frankenstein, they're talking as if it were in her book, which is kind of a weird thing to do. Like it's almost like they don't expect audiences to read or something like that. I don't know. I figure that maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the literary rate in the 1930s really wasn't that high. That must be the reason why they did this first scene like this. Anyway, the reason I'm bringing all of this up is because as they're talking about it, they're playing scenes from Frankenstein. So this is like a previously on, like Frankenstein played 5 years ago, so you probably don't remember the events of that movie. So we're going to play these scenes to kind of jog your memory about what happened from that previous movie from 5 years ago. So that was fascinating. I was like, oh my goodness, they're doing a previously on Frankenstein. And then after that little scene, then they start the movie. So that was interesting because they start the movie with Mary telling the rest of the story. Once they do that scene, the movie really gets started. So one of my favorite parts is like just how the cleverness with which they decide to bring the monster back, or how because the monster looked like he was quite dead. Well, not dead, but quite trapped. Because that was, I think, the genius of the first movie was they didn't actually show the monster dying. They just showed that he had burning wood had landed on top of him. And so you could see that, yeah, he could, that if there was a way that they can get him out of that situation, then they would do it. And I think it was pretty good. It was I don't know how common it is to have like some kind of well or some kind of underground cavern under a windmill, but that's how they solved that. Somehow the fire or whatever, it weakens some of the supports for the windmill. The windmill collapsed, and it was able to open up an underground cavern for Frankenstein to fall into with the debris. And then from there, he's able to rescue himself. But not before he runs into, like, I think a guy there's like I said earlier, there are a couple of people that kind of stray behind after most of the mob moves off. So like 2 or 3 people stay behind because they want to see the actual burnt remains of the monster. And so there's a guy and there are 2 women. The guy sees that there's a way to go into into this underground chamber. So he goes down to see if he can find the remains of the monster. And it turns out the monster is alive. And he's not thrilled that this guy is kind of walking around in this underground chamber with this torch in his hand. I think he had a torch or he had a pitchfork or something like that. And it was menacing to the monster. So the monster took it as a threat and then just grabbed him and drowned him. And then so that may have been a little justified, but then he starts crawling out of this underground cavern. And when he comes up, as he starts to come up, the man's wife sees that somebody's coming up from under the cavern. So she offers her hand. And when she starts to pull up, she notices that it's not her husband, it's the monster. And she starts to scream, but then he just yanks her down into the cavern as well. And she falls, she hits some rocks, she lands in the water. She does not survive that. And then when he finally gets out, he runs into Minnie. And Minnie had been talking some mad shit about Frankenstein, about how terrible, I mean, not Frankenstein, but Frankenstein's monster and how terrible and horrible he was. and the monster kind of looks at her, and she does the comic thing where they do a double take behind them or whatever, and then she hops and starts running away and screaming and whatnot. So she alone, at least at that time, knows that the monster is alive. The monster survived the collapse of the burning windmill. And so I kind of like that, because it's like, oh, this movie's starting right away. They're not taking a slow pace approach. This time they're quickening the pace on this movie. And I think I appreciated that. It lines up more with my sensibilities when I watch movies. And so I kind of like that. I kind of like that scene where it's like, it kind of starts right away. It kind of is, he's more horrifying because with the callousness with which he kills these people. I mean, even though he might be scared, he might be defending himself. I mean, there really is no justification for killing that woman who was helping him out of the cavern, even though she thought she was helping out her husband. It was like no real reason for him to kill her, but he did, I guess, because he was still kind of sore. She was, after all, part of the angry mob with pitchforks and torches chasing him throughout the forest. So that could be the reason why. Maybe that was his justification. But it was kind of horrifying in the way he did it. And the other thing that was especially tragic, or it's also, it depends on how you look at it. It's either tragic or it's kind of contrived, however, whatever your sensibilities are, because these two people are the parents of a little girl he accidentally drowned. So in the original movie, he had come across this little girl and she was throwing flowers in the water, and she gave him some flowers. He started throwing the flowers in the water and laughing, and it was the happiest he was in his life up until that point, having just been born or reanimated, however you look at the creation of Frankenstein. And then after he ran out of flowers, he picked her up and threw her in the water because he thought pretty things go in the water, and she didn't come up. And he was shocked by this, and he realized he made a mistake, and he started running off. And so he accidentally killed this little girl. And the people he kills at the beginning of The Bride of Frankenstein, the first two people he kills are her parents. Now, that's tragic, because the man is going on about how the monster killed his girl, and he wants to see the burnt bones of the monster and whatnot. And so the monster killed an entire family. So that's a little bit tragic. Another thing I wanted to point out was that these characters, a lot of the characters did not reprise their role. So the man playing the father of the girl that had been drowned is cast differently. It's a different actor playing this role. And his wife wasn't in the first movie, so she's not a problem. Also, the role of Elizabeth has been changed. At first, it was played by Mae Clarke in the original movie, but in this movie, the role of Elizabeth went to Valerie Hobson. And that's all right. That's fine. Also, there's also the burgomaster. In the original movie, the role of the burgomaster was Lionel Belmore, and in the new movie, it's E.E. Clive. And that's all fine too. The only thing that bothers me about all of this is that there's no continuity control. There's no effort to make sure that the people from the previous movie look like the people in the sequel. So, and this is especially galling because it'd be one thing if the events of the sequel takes place like several months or maybe a couple of years after the events of the first movie. But in this case, in this movie, it's happening at the same time. Like, it's not a month later. It's not a week later. It's not a day later. It's that same night. Like, later that night. It's like maybe a couple of hours after the tower has been burning. Or maybe it was just a few minutes because they got to rescue Dr. Frankenstein from the tower. And that's where the movie starts. They pick up Dr. Frankenstein from the tower and take him to Chateau Frankenstein. And Elizabeth is like his fiance, and they're supposed to be getting married. So in the original, Mae Clarke had very short hair, blonde and wavy. And in the sequel, you had Valerie Hobson, and she has long dark hair and not quite as wavy. And so it looks like a completely different person. They made no effort to match they could have at least cut and dyed her hair, but they didn't do it. She looks like a completely different person. And this is supposed to be the same night. And it was like, they were like, nope, they're not going to make sure it's the same. And the same for everybody that was recast. If there was anybody that was recast in this movie, they look completely different, and they're hard to recognize. So, for example, the burgomaster, he's completely different. He's a tall, skinny dude instead of the kind of shorter, rounder dude from the original movie. The father of the drowned girl, he was a slim dude in the original. And the sequel, he's a more robust dude. He's kind of rounder. He's a little thicker around the middle. So I just found that the fact that they made no effort with maintaining the continuity, I thought that was fascinating. Also, even the costumes look a little bit different. Like, the costumes in The Bride of Frankenstein look much more modern than the costumes in the original Frankenstein. So there's that. It felt like The Bride of Frankenstein actually takes place like 3 or 4 decades after the events of the original Frankenstein movie. But anyway, I was talking about. Well, let me continue. So another one of my favorite parts is Minnie the maid. I mentioned Minnie. She was the one that the monster let live after murdering 2 people. He came across Minnie that same night in the by the burning windmill, and she sees him, and she kind of jumps or hops and runs away. And it was at that time that I figured that, yes, she's the comic relief, and she was used to great effect. I mean, I'm not laughing ha at her antics, but I am recognizing that what she's doing is funny, and she's kind of mouthy. She's talking smack to everyone. She talks smack to everyone except Dr. Frankenstein himself. And it's just that, her funny way of speaking, and the things that she's kind of like the type of person that would say, kiss my grits, but she's saying it in a foreign way. So that's why I'm not laughing ha at it, because I don't get the vernacular that she's using, but I understand it's just by the way she's speaking that, oh yeah, that's a funny person right there. It's kind of hard to explain. It's like, that it's funny. It's just not funny enough to make you involuntarily roll over with laughter. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I recognize the effort. So I'm not exactly sure how many parts that I mentioned were my favorite parts. It's probably going to be 6 this episode, because I've already lost count. But one of the things I wanted to mention, I talked about Dr. Pretorius. Dr. Pretorius is very peculiar. He's a guy that kind of talks. He kind of lies casually, so you can't necessarily trust what he's saying. At one time, he tells somebody, have some gin. Gin is my only vice. I think he tells that to Dr. Frankenstein. And later on, he meets up with Frankenstein's monster, and he says, have a smoke. Smoking is my only vice. Apparently, this guy has a lot of vices, and he just pretends that he only has one vice, but he has a bunch of vices. One of his vices, I would guess, is creating little people. There's actually a word for this. So he creates these homunculi, these little people. They're not really little people. They're tiny people. They're like doll-sized people, and they're called homunculi. And I guess it's kind of from like alchemy or something like that. The idea that you could create tiny doll-sized people from, or action figure-sized people. That's what they are. They're action figure-sized people from various alchemical means. So it turns out, so it's a bizarre scene, because it's not something that I expected to see in this movie. I don't know what it was. I don't know, maybe it's because the special effect was fascinating. Like, it actually still looks good. These tiny people that he keeps in these jars, the jars the size of like a glass. So he keeps them in these these small jars. And like one of them is the queen. That was like the first one he creates. And it's a tiny woman dressed as a queen. And then he has a tiny man that's dressed as a king. He has another tiny man dressed as an archbishop. He has a tiny woman dressed as a ballerina. And he says that she'll only dance to Felix Mendelssohn's Spring Song. And apparently she won't dance any other way. The other tiny person he has is a mermaid, and he said that he grew this mermaid experimenting with seaweed. And then it's not displayed, but you can see in another scene that he has created an infant in a high chair. So I guess the censors saw that and I was like, that's a step too far. In the course of this scene where he's showing, Dr. Pretorius is showing these jars of tiny people, because they're in separate jars. He's showing these jars of tiny people to Henry Frankenstein to try to convince Henry Frankenstein to help him in his experiments. Dr. Pretorius wants to create full-size people, but so far he's only been able to create these tiny people, these homunculi. And he wants Henry's help to make a regular person, because he says he doesn't want to go through what Henry goes through and digging up corpses. He wants to grow his people from, he calls it seed. He wants to grow his people from seed, like cultures, like I guess you would grow bacteria. That's how he grew these tiny people. It's all kind of vague, but they have to leave it vague, right? Because they're not trying to it's science fiction without they're trying to skirt real science, I guess. Anyway, it's bizarre. It's a bizarre scene, and it's like they were shooting for the fences. I saw when they did this scene. Also, as I started to mention, the special effects were great. So you had these tiny peoples. They were, because you could see his giant hand like grabbing these jars and setting them down, and then the people as he was presenting them, like moving around and whatnot. And when the people spoke, they spoke in like a sped up English. So it sounds like sped up chipmunks, like from Alvin and the Chipmunks. You couldn't understand what they were saying. It was just sped up speech, like a tape recorder or a video on fast forward. And there's a part where the king gets out of his jar and he tries to go over to the queen because he's madly in love with the queen. And he has to grab the king with his pair of tonsils and then put the king back in his glass. And then he covered the glass with a cup and saucer to make it hard for the king to get out. I don't know how the king got out in the first place. But anyways, I like that scene. I just liked it for how bizarre it was. And it was this scene that kind of convinced Henry Frankenstein to assist Dr. Pretorius. And what's funny is that he's kind of wishy-washy. Like, he's a changed man. Like, he doesn't want to experiment with making life anymore. He doesn't want to do that. It's like, I think he's of the opinion that it's not his purview to experiment with life. And I think he's come to that conclusion with all the trouble that the monster has caused, that he's come to the realization that he shouldn't mess with the creation of life. I think that was supposed to be the lesson of the movie. I'm just making these guesses. These are the connection that everybody else seems to be making. So, and when I say everybody else, I'm talking about the people in the movie. So another one of my favorite parts, it's basically Frankenstein's monster. The monster is doing so much more than he did in the first movie. He's getting captured. He's escaping. He's fighting people. He's doing the most. But he's not just a rampaging monster. And that's kind of what attracted like other actors like Bela Lugosi to want to play Frankenstein in the first movie, because he's not just somebody who's rampaging. He has hopes and dreams and stuff like that, and it's kind of displayed. It's like he could be normal if he wasn't menaced like his entire life, and people weren't chasing him with fire and pitchforks, and they just patient with him, then he could be somewhat normal. Like I had mentioned when I talked about Frankenstein in the previous podcast, that it seemed like all he known, like since he was created, was like torture and pain, and like Dr. Frankenstein was like disgusted with him. Like it's like he didn't have the proper attitude towards the monster he created, and he didn't protect the monster from Fritz, who kept beating the monster with like whips and whatnot, and they kept the monster like locked in a room, and it just wasn't a great existence. And so, like, I guess the question is, who is the real monster in this movie? Is it? I think a lot of the monster can be put on Dr. Frankenstein himself. He's kind of monstrous from the first movie for allowing his creation to be beaten, and then kind of neglecting his creation, and then getting kind of upset that his creation won't act like a normal person, right? Like, how much abuse can you take? It's kind of the same with this movie. You kind of see that when he's treated with kindness, he's able to be kind. It's strange how that works. So after like the capture and escape and all this sort of thing, and you know, obviously he's going to kill a couple of people along the way. And then during his escape, he comes across this camp, and he scares this family away from their camp, and he sees this hot chicken, and he just, it's like they're camping out, so they're cooking chicken on a spit, and he tries to grab this chicken that's directly over this fire, or this just put out fire. The chicken is still like hot, and he tries to grab it with his bare hands, but he doesn't understand hot food, so he can't eat the chicken because he burnt his hand on it. And you know, he's growling and whatnot, he's running away. And during his escape, he comes across this cavern, and he hears music in his cavern, and he's happy again. It's like it's the greatest thing in the world at that moment when he hears this violin. And so he approaches the man who's playing this violin in this look like a hut, or this little habitat, just kind of off the beaten path. And the man welcomes him because the man is blind, so the man can't see Frankenstein, because this is the first person who doesn't scream in horror when Frankenstein, the monster, I keep saying Frankenstein, my apologies, but when the monster approaches, this man is not frightened because the man can't see him. He welcomes him in, come on. And the man is lonely. He wants a friend. The monster wants a friend. And because they have this mutual need for companionship, they get along. The blind man tells him how to speak. He teaches him words, and then he kind of teaches him, I don't know, I don't want to say table manners. He teaches him, I guess he's just showing kindness, sharing his home and sharing his food, and teaching him words and all this. And he's kind of an affable fellow. The man even is able to teach the monster that, you know, even fire is good, right? Because the man teaches him how to smoke. And he's like, because the man takes a match and he starts to light the cigarette and starts to, you know, puff on the cigarette. It's either a cigarette or a cigarello or a small cigar. I think it's more like a small cigar. And the monster's like, fire bad. And the man is like laughing at him. And he says, no, fire is good. Smoke is good. Here, smoke this. And not Frankenstein, but the monster, he starts smoking. And the funny thing about it is that he takes to smoking really easily. Like, he doesn't start coughing or choking or anything like that. He's like immediately smoking, and he immediately enjoys it. Like, he instinctively understands how to smoke, and he enjoys it immediately. So and that now smoking is good, and food is good, and drink is good. Like, all of these things he knows. But fire is still bad. Like, the guy's trying to tell him that fire is not bad. But the monster's like, no, fire is bad. Fire hurt. And so, he's burned a little bit. So he's like, fire's hurt. And so it's during this time that, the monster is discovered by the villagers, and they start, harassing again. And then there's fire, they burn down the man's hut, and they kind of kidnap the man. They think that the monster is menacing the man when those are his friends. And they escape with this dude, with the dude's house burning down. It was actually set on fire with the scuffle with the dudes when they discovered the hermit and the monster. And so the monster is alone again. So now he has to wander the forest, and then there's a posse on him. So he has to run from the posse, and then he runs and escapes, and he finds another friend. So the world is just full of friends. One of our next favorite parts is the monster finding Dr. Pretorius, and Dr. Pretorius is also friendly to the monster. Pretorius already knows the monster and the history and everything, so he's not afraid. So he greets him. He's friendly towards the monster. And what happens is the monster, to get away from the people seeking him out, he goes and hides in this underground crypt, and he's successful, right? That he's not discovered. But while he's there, some more people come into the crypt, and it turns out to be Dr. Pretorius and two of his assistants, and they go and they're actually looking. They still need dead body parts. They find like a 24-year-old, a woman who died at 24. So I guess they're going to use her bones. And his assistants leave. And when they're gone, he decides to have a picnic in this underground tomb by where they found these bones that he wants to use. And then when Frankenstein comes from hiding, because the guy has food, and he's like, I guess he's kind of hungry at that moment. So when he shows himself, he thinks the man is going to scream, but the man doesn't scream. Like, welcomes him in, go on, have some chicken and have some drink, have some smoke in it. And it's like, as he's eating, it's like he sees the bones. It's like, you're going to make a man like me? And the guy says, no, I'm going to make a woman for you, a friend. And the monster's like, yeah, I want a friend like me, a woman. Yeah, that'll be great. So he's down with the idea of making a person for him. And he understands that he was made. He understands that he was made by Dr. Frankenstein. He doesn't like Dr. Frankenstein because Frankenstein abandoned him. My last favorite part, because I've kind of been jumping. I liked a lot of parts in these movies, so it's hard to nail it down. I think I've named 6 or 7, and when I was trying to keep it down to 5, but this is going to be the last one. So this is like the kind of the resolution or the third act. I guess the whole third act is like one of my favorite parts. So I've been saying that Dr. Frankenstein is kind of wishy-washy over whether he wants to help the Dr. Pretorius or he wants nothing to do with Dr. Pretorius. And then it comes to the point where he just doesn't want to help make this monster. And then Dr. Pretorius brings Frankenstein, and Frankenstein says, you need to make this. You need to make this. And it's funny, right? Because there's a scene where Dr. Pretorius is like, I've brought somebody to help convince you to help me make this mate for the monster. And then the monster walks in to this room and he says, Frankenstein. So I think what's funny about that is that because like my entire life, I always called him the monster Frankenstein. And so it's funny when you hear the monster that you call Frankenstein say the word Frankenstein. It's kind of bizarre, I think, because of my association with the character. So in order to convince Henry Frankenstein to help them with this project, they kidnap, or mainly Frankenstein's monster kidnaps Elizabeth, his wife. Now it's his wife. So he has the Baroness. They keep her in a cave. Okay, there are a lot of bizarre parts I got to touch on. So they keep her in this cave in order to convince Dr. Frankenstein to help. And then at one point he says, how do I know she's even alive? How do I know that she still lives? Because you could be messing with me. And so Pretorius is like, just call her on this electrical device. You can pick up this electrical device and hold it to your hand. You can speak to her and you will hear her voice and you will know that she's alive. Now, apparently this is supposed to be a time before the telephone was invented, because he doesn't call it a telephone. He calls it an electrical device. So let's take a moment to examine this. You have Dr. Pretorius. He has invented the telephone, and he has invented tiny people that he grew from seed. And these tiny people, they're just real people just kind of running around in little jars that he dressed in little outfits. He made all of these things, and somehow he's not satisfied. I mean, he invented the telephone and just kept it to himself. That's fascinating. And he has these doll-sized people. Anyways, I'm just thinking that this dude is talented. He's talented, but I guess the excuse is that he's not well. Like he might be insane. They suggest that he's insane throughout the movie, so that must be the reason. And he's driven to create like a full-size human. That's his dream project. So I guess that's why he keeps pressing on. But I just can't get over that this dude invented the telephone and simply was not satisfied with that. And there's also another part that I wanted to mention, and that is when it's kind of similar to the scene when Frankenstein sent his assistant to get a brain, and then he gathers the brain. It's a normal brain. And then he's frightened. He drops it. He gets another brain that happens to be abnormal. So a similar thing happens where Dr. Pretorius sends his assistant because they have a heart that they're going to use for the project, but the heart is weak. It's not, they can't keep it working because they have it in this container with this solution, and they got an electrical current running through it. And the electric current's supposed to keep the heart beating, but the heart is too weak. It just doesn't want to work. And they try to change the solution, but it doesn't work. And Dr. Frankenstein says, it's just no use. This heart will never work. And so Dr. Pretorius sends his assistant out he tells his assistant to like go to the police station, or is either a police station or a hospital, just some place where they keep dead bodies. He's like, just go to that place and get a heart and then come right back here. But what the assistant does is that while he's on the road, he sees a woman, he murders a woman and bring back that woman's heart because it's fresh. And then, and the funny thing is that Pretorius knows this. When he told his assistant to go to the place to get the heart, he was telling his assistant to go kill somebody and bring back a fresh heart. But he was just using coded language. And then when he comes back, Dr. Frankenstein is suspicious. Like, this heart is suspiciously fresh. Where did you get this heart? I mean, it is so fresh. And then, the Dr. Pretorius is helping his assistant lie about where he got the heart from. So I thought that was rather humorous. That was funny to me. So this is all in the course of him making, the bride or the mate. Anyways, the monster at one point, the monster is impatient, and at one point he comes to Dr. Frankenstein and he says, because Dr. Frankenstein is starting to nod off. It's like he's working so hard. He's working to exhaustion, and he's actually still recovering from the fall. And then when the monster sees Dr. Frankenstein napping, he's like, wake up. You work, you sleep after you. He's like, the monster is the worst supervisor. He's the worst CEO. He's the worst boss you can have. He told this dude, you can sleep when you're dead. So the monster is so insistent and he's so unruly about getting the doctor to work that Dr. Pretorius has to distract him. So he basically gets a solution that he mixed with alcohol and gets the monster to drink it. The monster drinks it and he goes to sleep to give Dr. Frankenstein a chance to work on the project. And then so they finish the project. It's and then I mentioned how the monster is impatient. So what happens is that they have the body on the table, wrapped in bandages and whatnot, and they have to raise the body on a platform to the ceiling where it can be struck by lightning and then brought back down to the lab. It's another night with thunder and lightning, but no rain. They're so lucky. And a storm it's always a convenient storm when you're making a Frankenstein monster. So Pretorius has his assistants on the roof of the castle or whatever it is. And they're working on like the kites that are supposed to attract the lightning and the equipment that's on the roof. And the monster in the meantime has awoken up and goes to the roof and he starts harassing the assistants. Like he has no patience and no chill whatsoever. So in the process of him just rampaging, he grabs one of the assistants and throws him off the top of the tower. And kind of apropos of nothing. It's like he's kind of sick and tired of waiting for this experiment to be over. So in the course of all of this, they lower the body of the bride down to the room. They cut off the main bandages. She moves. They scream, she's alive. She's alive. It's the elation all over again. And they raise her on the platform. And as they're doing that, the monster comes downstairs from the roof and he sees that, the woman that they made for him is alive. And, he's happy. He tries to approach her. And this is what I remember when I was growing up. This is the scenes that I remember are these final moments. So I don't know what I was doing the rest of the film, but I do remember all of this. So she sees the monster and she screams. She reacts the exact same way that everybody reacts when they see him. She looks relatively normal. She has this wild hair and she's wrapped in bandages, but her face is not like the monster's face. Her face she looks like a regular woman. She's beautiful. She's got stitches around the base of her jawline, but otherwise she's quite attractive. And she's very tall, she's slim. They did good work. But she can barely walk, she can barely move. She can't speak, obviously. She moves with these jerky movements, which I kind of like. I like that affectation about her. And she looks suspiciously like Mary Shelley. But like she does not like the monster. She's more attracted to Dr. Frankenstein. Whenever she kind of moves toward Dr. Frankenstein and away from the monster. And so the monster is kind of upset now. He's upset because the woman that was made for him does not like him and is reacting like everybody reacts when they don't know him. It's like there are only a couple of people that don't scream in horror when they see his face. And so he starts kind of rampaging a little bit. At the same time, somehow, Dr. Frankenstein's wife, Elizabeth, is at the door of the tower. I don't know how she knew where they were at. I'm not even sure. Maybe it was the original tower where the original monster was made. I'm not exactly sure. But she found her way to the tower. And at the same time, Dr. Frankenstein is trying to leave. And the monster himself he happens to be near a lever that he's told will cause an explosion. And so the monster makes the decision that the bride of the monster isn't quite doing anything. She's kind of just standing around, kind of looking when she's not screaming or hissing at the monster. So the monster, he points to Dr. Frankenstein. He says, "You go live." And he gestures at Dr. Pretorius and he says, "You stay. We belong dead." And he pulls the lever, and then there's explosions all over the tower, and the tower collapses, and that is presumably the end of the monster, the bride of the monster, and Dr. Pretorius, and Dr. Frankenstein is able to escape with his wife. One thing I wanted to point out, that this is another kind of screed that I want to go on, again, about the name of the monster being referred to as Frankenstein. And the reason I want to go on this little screed again is because all throughout the time I was talking about the monster, I would accidentally call him Frankenstein, because that is what I had been calling him my entire life. And then I got on a mode when I realized that, wait a minute, his name, he doesn't have a name. He's a monster. The Frankenstein name belongs to the doctor, and he doesn't have a name. So we should just call him the monster. So you have Dr. Frankenstein and the monster. It took me a while to separate those two. And for a time, whenever somebody called the monster Frankenstein, I would say, no, his name is, he doesn't have a name. He's just a monster. It's the scientist who's Frankenstein. And then I read Mary Shelley's book, and the character of Frankenstein is a little bit different in the book. He's much more articulate in the book. You know, he talks even more, he's even more articulate in the book than he is in the movie. And so, like, in the movie, he kind of has the diction of like maybe a 3-year-old or maybe a 5-year-old. And in the book, he has the diction of like maybe a 15-year-old or even an adult, right? He talks like a regular person. So there's that. And the other thing is that he suggests that his name should be Adam to Dr. Frankenstein. And so for a while, I took it that was supposed to be his name. I thought the monster's name was supposed to be Adam. But as it turns out, that's not really his name. That's just what was suggested to him. But then, as I said on the previous Frankenstein episode, is that when a person makes something, it's often named after themselves or is referred to as themselves. So or like when somebody has a child, the child carries the name of the parent. So it's quite appropriate to refer to the monster as Frankenstein. That can be his name, since he was made by a man named Frankenstein. It's less cumbersome than calling him Frankenstein's monster, even though that is what we used to call people. We used to call them by their parents' name. Like, my last name is Richardson, and that is because they saw a child and it was like, who is that child? And they'll say, well, that's Richard's son. And this happened to a lot of people that there's Hinder's son. Or there's Melvin's son, and then that's how you get a name like Melvin's son, or something like that. Obviously, his name isn't Frankenstein's son. But that would work. But we also don't want to call him Frankenstein monster because it's kind of a mouthful. So you could just call him Frankenstein and it would be fine. And the reason that I'm bringing all of this up yet again is because there's a scene in this movie where Dr. Pretorius says the name of the movie. He says, there she is, the Bride of Frankenstein, which in context of the monster not being named Frankenstein doesn't make any sense, right? Because it's not, throughout the movie, they're talking about making a bride for the monster. It's a bride for the thing that Frankenstein created. Frankenstein has his own bride, Elizabeth. He's not marrying the monster he's created. He's marrying a regular woman. And Dr. Pretorius is making a bride for Frankenstein's monster, but he makes the announcement, the Bride of Frankenstein. He's referring to the monster. In that moment, he is calling the monster Frankenstein. So I don't know if it was kind of a slip or if they did it on purpose, or they just wanted to say the name of the movie in this scene near the end of the movie. But I guess I may be overthinking it. There is another context. And when you can say, when he says the Bride of Frankenstein, it's kind of a clumsy way of saying this is the bride that Frankenstein made. But Frankenstein didn't make the monster himself. It was Dr. Pretorius and Dr. Frankenstein who made the mate for Frankenstein's monster. So he should have said the Bride of Frankenstein and Pretorius, which also wouldn't make any sense. So, so that's my screed. It gets all kind of confusing, but when I heard that, I basically took it as Dr. Pretorius referring to the monster as Frankenstein. So anyway, all that to say that last act, that was another one of my favorite parts. This movie was fascinating because there's so many things that happened in it. Like I said, the special effects and the makeups were way better than I would have expected them to be in 1935. The print looked better, like the actual quality of the film, like the physical quality of the film looked better. The picture looked more crisp. It was less noisy. Like when you watch a lot of the older movies from 1931, you can hear there's like a hissing in the background. It's very noisy, but The Bride of Frankenstein was much less noisy. So from that, I take that it's like the advancement of film technology had jumped from between 1931 and 1935. So that's something else I appreciated. But when you think about it, if the studio had its way, it would have been a sequel like the very next year, or maybe even a couple of months from when the original movie was released. But they didn't quite have their way. They had to wait a few years until they could have gotten the director that they wanted. So that's it for our favorite parts. And now I'm going to jump over, talk about the trivia. Let me take another break to tell you about another podcast that I listen to called October Pod AM. And they have this fantastic Frankenstein story, or a series of Frankenstein stories. Here's Edward October to tell you more about that show.
There's a special night in the lives of all of us. A night to be daring. A night to be desirable. A night when we can break all the rules and make our own. It's coming to Octoberpod. Everyone is getting ready for Halloween night. It's a time for assembling costumes, putting on makeup, and making last-minute phone calls to your date for the costume party.
Hello? Is there somebody there?
Do you like classic horror stories?
Who's scaring me?
Spirits from an age gone by, speak again. The immortal tale of Frankenstein.
Even if you're too old for trick-or-treat, Edward October still has a terrifying treat for you this Halloween. The Satanic Rites of Frankenstein. This Halloween season, Octoberpod presents 4 terrifying new visions of Mary Shelley's immortal classic, Listen to the Satanic Rites of Frankenstein, a special Halloween event presented by Octoberpod AM. Your very soul may depend upon it.
Starts playing Tuesday, October 15th. Listen to Octoberpod AM on Spreaker, YouTube, or wherever you get podcasts. Check local listings.
So this is the top 10 trivia. I'm actually going to stick to 10 points, 10 things that I found really interesting about this movie, The Bride of Frankenstein. And I got it all from IMDb. And I think most of this is accurate. I accidentally cross-referenced it with other sources. So we have cinematographer John Maskell presented a problem with his drinking. It was so it's not just Clive. I guess people were just freebasing alcohol for this production. But his drinking problem was so serious that the studio had to provide a car to get him safely to and from the set. Nevertheless, he was very good at his job, even when drunk. And James Whale liked that he worked fast and rarely wasted time fussing with incidental camera and lighting hardware. So yeah, that was, people that had problems with alcohol. Up next, Marilyn Harris, who plays Maria, the girl the monster accidentally kills in the original Frankenstein from 1931, appears uncredited as another young girl. She is the leader of a group of young schoolgirls who encounter the monster as he runs away from the blind man's burning house. Director James Whale deliberately gave her a one-line word, "Look," so she could be paid more by the studio as an actor with a speaking role instead of as an extra. That was kind-hearted of him. Jack P. Pierce altered the makeup of Frankenstein's monster from this film's predecessor to reflect that he had survived the mill fire at the end of Frankenstein with some flesh burns and with much of his hair singed off. So yeah, you notice that there was kind of a different, there was some burning, and he also got shot at least once. So he had suffered. Boris Karloff protested against the decision to make the monster speak, but was overruled. Since he was required to speak in this film, Karloff was not able to remove his partial bridge work as he had done to help give the monster his sunken cheek appearance in the first Frankenstein. That's why the monster appears fuller of the face in the sequel. But that's not to worry, because there are people in this film that don't even look like the previous version of that character. So it's fine. It's fine. Not long before filming began, Colin Clive broke a leg in a horse riding accident. Consequently, most of Henry Frankenstein's scenes were shot with him sitting or lying in bed, which is apropos since in the previous film, his character was thrown off a 3-story windmill. That's bound to hurt. And another thing about this movie is that he seemed to recover from that windmill fall really fast. Like he was lying in bed, and then Dr. Pretorius comes like, "You got to come right now to see these experiments that I'm doing." And so he gets up, right? So he's like hurt, but he's not that hurt as far as his character is concerned. His character's hurt, but his character's not that hurt. And he recovered entirely too fast from that windmill fall. To me, that's one of the criticisms that I had. This movie was moving really fast. Like, as far as the timeline is concerned, like they could have had a blurb that said like a couple of weeks later or a couple of months later, but they didn't do any of that. Everything almost seemed to happen in one night, maybe 2 or 3 nights. This movie takes place in less than a week. When filming the scene where the monster emerges from the burnt windmill, Boris Karloff slipped and fell into the water-filled well. Upon being helped out, it was discovered that he had dislocated a hip in the fall. The hip was strapped into place, and Karloff soldiered on. He continued to receive massage and heat treatments for the hip for the rest of the shooting of the film. Man, that is why we use stunt people, or somehow find it a safe way for actors to do these things, right? This was on a set. This was on a controlled set, and he still fell and broke his hip. That's kind of messed up. Elsa Lanchester said that her spitting, hissing performance was inspired by the swans in Regent's Park, London. "They're really very nasty creatures," she said. And I concur. Swans, I had a close encounter with a swan, and I had no idea how just threatening those creatures are. And then I seen a video of a swan like chasing tigers, right? Chasing animals that has no business being threatening towards. They really will pretend that they're the most threatening creatures on the planet. They are like chihuahuas, except when you think about it, swans are very large and strong. But at the same time, this swan was chasing a tiger. It was a tiger. Anyway, back to Elsa. She also screamed and hissed herself hoarse for the performance as the monster's mate. Lanchester was only 5'4", but was placed on stilts that made her 7 feet tall. She had to spend days trussed up tightly in bandages. She needed to be fed by her dresser through a straw since even her fingers were wrapped. In fact, the bandages were so tight that she was unable to move and had to be carried about the studio. According to one story, one of her stand-ins had a screaming attack of claustrophobia. Man, it sounds traumatic. James Whale was so set on having Opie Hedgie play the blind hermit that he shut down production from February 19th to March 2nd in 1935, while waiting for Hedgie to finish a production at RKO. RKO is a rival studio. The Tiny Mermaid in Dr. Pretorius's bottle was Josephine McKim, a member of the 1924 and 1928 U.S. Women's Olympic swim teams, and one of the 4 members of the team to win the 1928 gold medal in the 400-meter freestyle relay. McKim was also Maureen O'Sullivan's body double in the wonderful nude swimming scene of the previous year's Tarzan and his mate from 1934. Now, I had to investigate this. I'm like, they had a nude swimming scene in 1934 in a regular movie, not even a movie that they, deemed like rated X, but actually there was no rating system, but still, I thought it was like, there's no way there's a nude swimming scene in a Tarzan movie, because I remember I watched Tarzan movies on TV when I was growing up. Now, obviously, they're going to cut out, it's going to be the edited version, because it's like, it wasn't cable, it was regular TV. But I can't imagine there being a nude swimming scene. So naturally, I'm looking on YouTube, and sure enough, there is a nude. I mean, in the first place, you can see her bottom. It's, for one thing, Tarzan, he still has his loincloth on him. Like, he's not exposing any part of his groin area. But the woman he was swimming with was completely naked. Because I thought she had something on. It's like, no, you can see the crack of her back. You can see the crack of her behind. So I was like, oh my God, she's swimming around. And then she turns around to the front and you can see her chest. It was like, oh, it's actually a nude swimming scene in 1934. That's crazy. Also, apropos of this, I remember watching and, doing we talked about Planet of the Apes on this podcast too. And Planet of the Apes, this is when they did have a rating system, and Planet of the Apes is rated G. And in G-rated Planet of the Apes, they showed a man's bare ass. I'm like, oh my God, the rating system was so different. Back in, I think Planet of the Apes came out in like 1970 something. So in the 1970s, they were like, it's perfectly fine for children to see a man's bare ass. This movie gets a G rating. And then also he says damn in the movie. And there's probably a hell in that movie as well. So anyways, the last bit of trivia I have is director James Whale originally did not want to do a sequel to Frankenstein. For a time, Universal considered producing a sequel without Whale's involvement. One possible story included an educated monster continuing Henry's research, while another chronicled Henry's creation of a death ray on the eve of a world war. However, after 4 years of badgering by Universal, Whale agreed to do the film. So that's nice. I'm glad he changed his mind, because this was actually a good movie. It like I said, it had a lot of things happening in the movie, a lot of things that were unexpected. The tiny people in the jars took me aback. You had a joyful monster or a monster that could be joyful if just given a chance. He's very sympathetic in this film. You kind of understand, you almost understand his feelings. He just wasn't cared for. And when he was cared for, he reciprocated. And when he wasn't cared for, he'd probably kill you. But it's like, it's someone who could be managed. It's like we could have got through it, but the problem was he was just created by the wrong people. So let's take a look at what the critics thought. The critics gave it a 98%, and the audience popcorn meter has it at 87% on Rotten Tomatoes. And in IMDb reviews, it has a 7.8 out of 10. It's slightly higher than the predecessor. At first, we have Caitlin Nelson from Daily Grindhouse. She writes, "What makes The Bride such a powerful entry in the Frankenstein canon and the classic Universal series as a whole is its ability to keep its horror under the surface. Only occasionally does it truly allow it to come through to the forefront full force." And yeah, that's accurate. I would say that that's accurate. Because the monster isn't killing and maiming all of the time. Mike Macy from Gone with the Twins wrote, "The chief new element is the monster's bride, played by Elsa Lanchester, who doesn't appear in her entirety until approximately 5 minutes before the movie ends." And so, in one note, there was, I usually like to have like both positive and negative reviews, but when I went to the the Rotten Tomato website only had one negative or Rotten Tomato review, and it was from this guy, Mike Massey, and he really missed the mark because there was a bunch of new elements. There was Dr. Pretorius. There was the little people, which I can't stop talking about. There was a joyful monster that could speak. There was Minnie, the maid. There were so many other added elements to this movie. There was even Dr. Frankenstein himself was a changed man. It was like after creating the monster and realized the rampaging that the monster was doing, like he had changed his mind about creating life and had to be bribed and cajoled and threatened and tempted into doing the experiment again. So there were a lot of this movie was just different. It was just a different movie, and I don't understand how Massey doesn't see this. Up next is Roger Ebert from the Chicago Sun-Times. He wrote, "Seen today, Whale's masterpiece is more surprising than it was when it was made because today's audiences are more alert to its buried hints of homosexuality, necrophilia, and sacrilege, but you don't have to deconstruct it to enjoy it." And so, yeah, I did read a little bit about that. And they're talking mainly about Dr. Pretorius. There was hints that he may be homosexual. I think there was like a novelization of the movie where they kind of explore it just a tiny bit more. It's like the hints are more obvious. It's like there's a line where he suggests that he can't create life naturally, so he has to do it scientifically or artificially, and that was due to his sexuality. Obviously, they didn't say anything like out loud, but there was a lot of stuff hinted at. I don't know about the necrophilia though. I guess because both Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein. Well, I'm saying it wrong. I'm saying it wrong in the context of how I'm trying to communicate this. Both the monster and the mate of the monster are dead. They're dead, and then they're resurrected, I guess, from dead flesh. So there, I guess in that case is a suggestion of necrophilia, but not. Yeah, I guess that could be a hidden message about that. And lastly, we have Sarah Ward from Flicks, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. She wrote, "Will proves a master of moody thrills, while Boris Karloff is as silently expressive as the hulking monster." And there you have it. Yeah, I think Moody Thrills, I think, is a good is a good way of describing how well handled the subject matter. Finally, The Bride of Frankenstein is, as of this recording, available with a subscription on Peacock. That's it for today. Next week, we conclude our horror-themed October with a movie that we watched as a family wearing 3D glasses that we got from 7-Eleven when I was, I want to say, like 10 or 11 years old. Or 12. So it was somewhere around there. Gathered around, and I alluded to this earlier, gathered around the television because there was a special night where they were going to feature this movie and we were going to get to watch it on 3D. And that movie was The Creature from the Black Lagoon. You can follow us on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. Please contact us with any questions, comments, or suggestions at fanmail@backlickcinema.com. And if you're listening on YouTube, please like or subscribe. I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment. One last time, if you like this show, then please help us grow by spreading the word about Backlick Cinema, the podcast. Believe me, it matters. I've been Zoe Richardson. Be safe, share a movie from your studio with your family, hug your loved ones, and if you're going to be anything, be outstanding.